The corridor was silent except for the echo of polished boots on marble guard Thomas. Brennan had stood watch at Windsor Castle for 11 years. He had seen arguments, tears, and even thrown objects. But he had never seen what he witnessed that cold November. Morning, it started with a voice, sharp, cutting through the quiet like glass breaking. I said no, and I meant no. Thomas stood straighter. The voice belonged to Queen Camilla. She was in the blue drawing room, door half open. He wasn't supposed to listen. But sound travels in old castles. And some things you can't unhear. With all due respect, Your Majesty. The schedule was approved by Prince William himself. That voice was younger, female, calm, but firm. Thomas recognized it. Sophie Hartley, mid-30s. Prince William's new private secretary. She'd only been in the role for 3 months, but already people were talking. She got things done. She didn't bend easily. And that, apparently, was the problem. I don't care what William approved, Camilla snapped. I am Queen Consort. You will move that engagement, or you will find yourself jobless by tea time. Silence. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Staff didn't defy royalty. Not if they wanted to keep their positions. Not if they wanted to stay in the palace at all. He'd seen people dismissed for far less. A misplaced comment. A forgotten beau? This was open defiance. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe. We bring you the most emotional and unbelievable true stories from around the world. Now, back to what happened next. Sophie's voice came again, steady, unflinching. Your Majesty, the engagement is with a children's hospice. It's been scheduled for 4 months. The families are expecting the prince. If I move it now, it sends a message, and not the message the prince wants to send. Thomas had never heard anyone speak to the Queen Consort like that. Not even senior royals. The air seemed to thicken. He imagined Camilla's face. Red. Furious. But Sophie wasn't finished. I work for Prince William. My loyalty is to him and to the work he believes in. I respect your position, but this is not your decision to make. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop. Thomas's hand tightened on his ceremonial rifle. He knew what came next. Fury, a phone call, security. Sophie would be escorted out by lunch. But what happened next shocked him even more. Footsteps, fast. Camilla stormed out of the room, her face tight with rage. She didn't even glance at Thomas. She just swept past him, her heels clicking like gunfire on the floor. Sophie stepped into the doorway. She was pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her blazer, but her chin was up. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She had just committed career suicide, and she knew it. Thomas wanted to say something. To warn her? To tell her to run, apologize, do anything to fix this. But he couldn't. He was a guard, invisible. Silent, Sophie walked past him. Her breath unsteady, but her stride purposeful. And that's when Thomas saw him, at the far end of the corridor, standing in the shadow of a stone archway. Was Prince William. He had been there the whole time. He had heard everything, and the look on his face was not anger. It was something else entirely, something that made Thomas realize that the power inside these walls was about to shift in a way no one had seen coming. Prince William didn't move. Not at first. He stood there, half in shadow, watching Sophie walk away. His jaw was set. His eyes were sharp. Thomas had guarded this man for years, through grief and joy, through scandal and celebration. He knew that look. It was the look of a decision being made. Sophie turned a corner and disappeared. The corridor fell quiet again. William straightened his jacket and began walking. Not toward Camilla. Toward Sophie. Thomas remained at his post, but his mind was racing. Protocol dictated that he'd forget what he'd heard, that he remain neutral, that he become invisible. But some moments burn themselves into memory, whether you want them to or not. 20 minutes later, whispers began spreading through the staff corridors like wildfire. Did you hear? Sophie Hartley. She's finished. Camilla's going to have her removed by the end of the day. Thomas heard it all during the changing of the guard. The other staff were buzzing. Some felt sorry for Sophie. Others thought she'd been reckless. A few admired her courage but agreed it was wasted. You don't stand up to the queen consort. Not if you value your career, but by late afternoon. Something strange happened. Sophie Hartley was still there. Not only was she still there, she was seen walking with Prince William through the East Gallery. They were talking. Closely. Seriously. William's head was slightly bent toward her, listening. She held a tablet, gesturing at the screen. They looked like two people working, planning, moving forward. No apology. No dismissal. No consequences. Thomas heard the confusion in the whispers now. Why hasn't she been fired? Camilla must be furious. What's William doing? The answer came the next morning. Thomas was stationed near the king's private office. When he saw Camilla walking briskly down the hall, her face was tight. Her assistant trailed behind, struggling to keep up. She knocked once on the king's door and entered without waiting for a reply. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the tone. Camilla's voice rose and fell in sharp waves. The king's voice was lower, calmer, but firm. When Camilla emerged 15 minutes later, her expression had changed. She wasn't angry anymore. She was something worse. She looked defeated that afternoon. An announcement was made to senior palace staff. Sophie Hartley was being elevated. She wasn't just Prince William's private secretary anymore. She was now senior advisor to the Prince of Wales. With expanded authority over his entire schedule, public engagements, and charitable priorities, it was a promotion. A public one, and everyone knew what it meant. Thomas stood in the staff hall as the news spread. He watched faces go pale. He saw people glance nervously toward the queen consort's quarters. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. William hadn't just protected Sophie. He had rewarded her for defying Camilla. The message was unmistakable. The Prince of Wales was drawing a line. He was no longer bending to influence, no longer deferring to voices that didn't align with his vision. He was building his own team, his own structure, his own future, and Camilla. She had just learned that her authority had limits. One senior aide, a man named Gregory, who had served the family for 30 years, stood beside Thomas near the window. He stared out at the gardens, his face unreadable. "Things are changing," Gregory said quietly. Thomas nodded. He didn't need to respond. They both knew the old guard was fading. A new power was rising. And it wasn't asking for permission anymore. That evening, Thomas saw Sophie again. She was leaving the palace, her bag slung over her shoulder, her steps lighter than they had been the day before. She smiled at a passing gardener. She looked free. She had gambled everything on principle, and she had won. But as Thomas returned to his post, one question lingered in his mind. What would Camilla do now? The palace felt different in the days that followed. Thomas noticed it first in the silences. The way people stopped talking when certain names were mentioned. The way eyes darted toward doorways before conversations continued. The way staff chose their words carefully, as if the walls themselves were taking sides. Camilla didn't attend the next family dinner. The official reason was a migraine, but the staff knew better. She was furious. And worse than that, she was embarrassed. For years, she had quietly influenced decisions behind the scenes. A word here. A suggestion there. People listened because she was the queen consort. Because she had the king's ear. Because defying her meant consequences. Until Thomas was on night duty, when he overheard two senior aides talking in hushed tones near the library. She tried to have Sophie reassigned, one of them said, pushed for her to be moved to a junior role in Scotland, and William refused. Didn't even consider it. Told them Sophie stays exactly where she is. There was a pause, then a low whistle. He's really doing it, isn't he? He's separating himself. Not just separating. He's making it clear who's in charge of his household. And it's not her. Thomas kept walking, but the words stayed with him. This wasn't just about one staffer. This was about control. About the future. about what kind of monarchy William intended to lead, and apparently, it didn't include interference. 3 days later, Thomas witnessed the second confrontation. It happened in the Rose Garden. The king was walking with Camilla and William. It was supposed to be a casual stroll, a photo opportunity, a show of unity. But Thomas, stationed near the garden entrance, could see the tension in their postures. Camilla's voice carried across the gravel path. "You're making a mistake, William. Sophie is inexperienced. She doesn't understand the delicacy required in these matters." William stopped walking. He turned to face her, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sophie understands exactly what's required," he said. His tone was polite, but cold. "She understands loyalty. She understands the causes I care about. And she understands that my office answers to me, not to anyone else." The king placed a hand on William's shoulder. "Let's not do this here." But William didn't move. His eyes stayed on Camilla. "I respect you," he said, "but my staff, my schedule, and my priorities are not up for negotiation. If that's difficult to accept, I'm sorry, but it won't change." Camilla's face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but the king gently took her arm. "Darling, please." She looked at him, then at William, and for just a moment, Thomas saw something flicker across her face. Not anger, not pride, hurt. She turned and walked back toward the palace, her steps quick and uneven. The king followed, glancing back at William with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Disappointment? Understanding? Both? William stood alone in the garden for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly, ran a hand through his hair, and walked in the opposite direction. Thomas had never seen anything like it. Royal families argued, yes, but not like this. Not so publicly, not with such finality. That evening, Sophie was seen entering William's office with a stack of documents. She stayed for over an hour. When she left, she looked focused, determined. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving, and the rest of the staff noticed. Younger aides began approaching her with ideas. She was no longer seen as a risk. She was seen as the future, but not everyone was pleased. One of Camilla's longest-serving aides, a woman named Margaret, began spreading quiet criticism. "She's too ambitious," Margaret said over tea in the staff lounge. "She doesn't know her place." Younger assistant, no older than 25, looked up from her phone. "Maybe her place is exactly where she is," the assistant said. "Maybe it's time things worked differently." Margaret's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. The divide was deepening, and everyone could feel it. Thomas returned to his quarters that night and sat on the edge of his bed, still in uniform. He thought about the families he'd served, the traditions, the rules, the unspoken hierarchies that had held the palace together for generations. And he thought about Sophie, a woman who'd refused to bow when bowing was expected, who'd been promoted for her defiance instead of punished. Something fundamental had shifted, and Thomas realized, with a strange mix of unease and hope, that there was no going back. 2 weeks passed. The palace settled into an uneasy rhythm. Camilla attended events with the king. She smiled for cameras. She performed her duties. But anyone who looked closely could see the distance growing. She rarely crossed paths with William, and when she did, their exchanges were brief, polite, empty. Sophie, meanwhile, was everywhere. She coordinated a major mental health initiative. She restructured William's public appearances to focus on causes he was passionate about. She brought in new voices, younger staff, people who saw the monarchy not as it had been, but as it could be. Thomas watched her move through the palace with quiet confidence. She didn't gloat. She didn't flaunt her victory. She simply worked. But there were whispers. Always whispers. She's changing everything. She's pushing too hard. William trusts her too much. And then came the leak. It started with a tabloid headline. Power struggle at the palace. Prince William staffer defies Queen Camilla and wins. The story was detailed. Too detailed. It described the confrontation in the blue drawing room, the promotion, the tension between William and Camilla, even some of the private conversations. Someone had talked. Thomas saw the fallout immediately. The king was furious. Security was tightened. Investigations began. Staff were questioned. Everyone was suspect. Camilla's aides pointed fingers at Sophie's circle. Who else benefits from this story? Margaret said coldly during a tense meeting, but Sophie's allies pushed back. This makes everyone look bad? Why would we leak it? The truth was, no one knew. But the damage was done. The private war had become public, and the world was watching. That afternoon, Thomas was stationed outside the king's study when raised voices echoed through the door. "This is humiliating, Charles." Camilla's voice, louder than he'd ever heard it. "It's a news story," the king replied. "It will pass. It's not just a story. It's a message. Your son has made it clear that I have no authority, that I can be dismissed, overruled, ignored. Silence." Then the king's voice, quieter now. "You overstepped." "I what?" "You tried to control his office, his staff, his schedule. William is not a child, Camilla. He's the heir. He will be king, and he will not be managed. I was trying to help. You were trying to influence. There's a difference." Thomas heard something that sounded like a sob, then footsteps. The door opened. Camilla walked out, her face red, her eyes wet. She didn't look at Thomas. She didn't look at anyone. She just left. The king appeared in the doorway a moment later. He looked exhausted. He saw Thomas, nodded once, and closed the door. Thomas's chest felt tight. He had served this family for over a decade. He had watched them grieve, celebrate, struggle, and endure. But this felt different. This felt like something breaking. That evening, Thomas was in the staff dining hall when Sophie walked in. The room went quiet. She paused, sensing the shift. Then she walked to the counter, picked up a tray, and got her food. She sat alone at a table near the window. For a moment, no one moved. Then a young assistant joined her. Then another. Within minutes, half a dozen staff members were sitting with her, talking, laughing quietly. But the other half of the room stayed where they were, watching, judging. The palace was splitting. Not violently, not loudly, but splitting all the same. Thomas finished his meal and left. As he walked the dimly lit corridors, he thought about loyalty, about change, about what happens when tradition collides with progress, and he thought about the young woman who had refused to back down, even when it could have cost her everything. The next morning, Prince William made an unexpected move. He held a private meeting with senior palace staff. Thomas wasn't inside, but he heard about it later from Gregory, the longtime aide. "He thanked us," Gregory said, his voice low, "for our service, for our dedication." And then he said something I'll never forget. "What?" He said, "The world is changing. The monarchy must change with it. That doesn't mean abandoning tradition. It means choosing which traditions serve the people and which serve only the past. I will always choose the people." Gregory paused, shaking his head. Then he looked directly at Margaret and two others who had been loyal to Camilla, and he said, "I hope you'll choose to come with me, but I'll understand if you can't." Thomas felt a chill. What did they say? Nothing. They just sat there. That night, Margaret submitted her resignation. Two others followed. The message was clear. William was building a new team, a new vision. And if you couldn't support it, there was no place for you. It was ruthless. But it was also necessary, and as Thomas stood watch that cold evening, looking out over the palace grounds, he realized something profound. The power shift wasn't coming. It had already happened. 3 weeks after the leak, the palace hosted a charity gala. It was the first major public event since the story broke. All eyes were on the royal family. Photographers lined the entrance. Reporters waited for any sign of tension. Thomas was stationed in the grand ballroom, watching the guests arrive in glittering gowns and tailored suits. The chandeliers cast warm light across the marble floors. Everything looked perfect, but behind the scenes, the atmosphere was ice. Camilla arrived first with the king. She wore a deep blue gown and a practiced smile. She greeted guests warmly, laughed at jokes, played her role flawlessly. To the outside world, nothing was wrong, but Thomas saw the way her eyes scanned the room, searching wary. "Prince?" William arrived 10 minutes later. Catherine was beside him, radiant in emerald green. And just behind them, clipboard in hand, was Sophie Hartley. Sophie wasn't supposed to be visible at events like this. Senior advisors usually stayed behind the scenes, but there she was, standing confidently beside the future king. Giving quiet instructions to staff, coordinating the evening's flow. It was a statement, a deliberate one. Thomas watched Camilla's face when she noticed. The smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. The evening proceeded smoothly. Speeches were given. Donations were announced. William spoke about mental health and the importance of breaking stigma. His words were powerful, genuine. The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause, but it was what happened after the speeches that stunned everyone. William called Sophie to the stage. "I want to take a moment," he said, "to recognize someone whose dedication has been extraordinary. Sophie Hartley has worked tirelessly to ensure that our efforts reach the people who need them most. She's challenged me, she's pushed me, and she's reminded me that leadership means listening to those who dare to speak truth." The room fell silent. People glanced at each other. Everyone knew what this was really about. Sophie climbed the steps to the stage, looking genuinely surprised. William shook her hand, then addressed the crowd again. "This work isn't about tradition for tradition's sake. It's about impact. It's about change. And it's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult." The applause was loud, enthusiastic, but not universal. Thomas saw Camilla's face. She wasn't clapping. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, her expression unreadable. The king leaned toward her and whispered something. She nodded slightly. Then, slowly, she brought her hands together in polite, measured applause. But the damage was done. The cameras had caught it. The guests had seen it. The divide was no longer private. After the gala, Thomas was stationed near the private exit when he saw Camilla leaving with the king. They walked in silence. No conversation. No connection. Just two people moving through the motions. He heard her say very quietly, "I've lost him, haven't I?" The king didn't answer right away. Then, gently, "You never had him to lose, darling. He was never ours to control." Camilla stopped walking. She turned to face him, tears brimming in her eyes. "I was only trying to help, to guide, to protect the family." "I know," the king said. "But William doesn't need protection. He needs space. And respect." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. Then they continued walking, and Thomas lost sight of them in the shadows. He felt something unexpected in that moment. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Sadness. Because this wasn't a story about good versus evil. It was a story about two people who wanted the same thing: to serve, to matter, to protect what they loved, but who had very different ideas about how to do it, and only one of them could lead. Later that night, Thomas passed Sophie in the corridor. She was carrying her coat, looking tired but content. "Long day," she said, offering a small smile. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied. She hesitated, then looked at him directly. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Thomas was caught off guard. Guards didn't give opinions. They didn't engage. But something about the vulnerability in her question made him pause. "I think," he said carefully, "you did what you believed was right. And that's the hardest thing to do." She nodded slowly. "It doesn't feel like winning. Maybe that's how you know it mattered." She smiled, a real one this time, and walked away. Thomas returned to his post, his mind swirling. He thought about power, about legacy, about the price of standing firm. The palace was quieter now. The gala was over. The guests had gone home. But the changes that had been set in motion would echo for years. William had made his choice. He had sided with principle over politics, with the future over the past. And Camilla had learned a painful truth. Influence is not the same as authority, as Thomas stood alone in the silent corridor. He realized that history was being written in real time, not with grand declarations or dramatic battles, but with small, steady acts of courage and one woman's refusal to bow. 6 months later, Windsor Castle looked the same as it always had. The same stone walls, the same grand halls, same ancient traditions. But everything had changed. Thomas stood at his usual post, watching the morning light filter through the stained glass windows. He had been transferred to day shift permanently now, a small promotion he hadn't expected. Life moved forward, Palace moved forward, but the echoes of that November morning remained. Camilla had retreated, quietly and with dignity. She still attended state functions, still performed her duties as queen consort, but she no longer tried to influence William's household. She had accepted the new reality, even if it stung. The king had worked to repair the relationship between his wife and his son. There were private dinners, cordial conversations, slow, careful steps toward peace. It wasn't perfect. But it was something William, meanwhile, had flourished. His initiatives were making headlines for the right reasons. His office ran efficiently. His public approval ratings had climbed steadily. And at the center of it all was Sophie Hartley. Now one of the most respected advisors in the royal household, she had proven herself not just with that one act of defiance, but with months of tireless, principled work. She had earned her place. Thomas saw her often now. She walked with confidence, but without arrogance. She listened to staff. She remembered names. She thanked the people who kept the palace running, the cleaners, the guards. One morning she stopped beside Thomas as he stood watch near the East Gallery. "Morning, Thomas," she said warmly. "Good morning, ma'am." She glanced around the empty corridor, then lowered her voice slightly. "Can I ask you something? Of course. That day, the day it all happened. You were there, weren't you?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Did you think I was insane?" He allowed himself a small smile. "I thought you were brave, possibly insane." She laughed softly. "Fair assessment." There was a pause. Then she said, more seriously, "I didn't do it to make a statement. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Those families deserved that visit. I couldn't let anyone, no matter who they were, take that away." "I know," Thomas said. "And I think Prince William knew it too." She nodded, her eyes distant. "I was terrified, you know? I thought I'd be packing my things by noon, but you weren't." "No. Because someone believed that doing the right thing mattered more than keeping the peace." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Sophie smiled. "Thank you, Thomas, for being here, for seeing it." "Just doing my job, ma'am." "No," she said gently. "You were a witness. And sometimes, that's the most important job of all." She walked away, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. He realized she was right. He had been a witness to something remarkable, not a scandal, not a fight, but a transformation. A young prince stepping into his power, a staffer finding her courage, a family learning that love and respect sometimes mean letting go of control. Later that week, Thomas was invited to a private ceremony in the palace gardens. It was small, intimate, just senior staff and a few members of the royal family. Prince William stood at the center, holding a small wooden box. He opened it and pulled out several medals, commendations for exceptional service. He called names one by one. Long-serving staff who had dedicated decades to the crown. And then he called Sophie's name. She stepped forward, visibly emotional. William pinned the medal to her jacket and shook her hand. Then, unexpectedly, he hugged her, brief but genuine. "Thank you," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "for reminding me what leadership looks like." The applause was warm and heartfelt. Even some of Camilla's former aides, the ones who had stayed, clapped with sincerity. Because in the end, this wasn't about sides. It was about a shared commitment to something bigger than any one person. After the ceremony, Thomas stood near the garden gate, watching the sun set over the castle grounds. Gregory approached, hands in his pockets. "Quite a day," Gregory said. "Quite a year," Thomas replied. Gregory chuckled. "You know, I've worked here for 30 years. I've seen prime ministers come and go. I've seen scandals and triumphs. But I've never seen anything quite like this. Like what? Someone standing up for what's right and actually winning. Usually, the system crushes them. But Sophie, she changed the system. Thomas nodded. Maybe it was ready to change. Maybe, Gregory said. Or maybe it just needed someone brave enough to push. They stood together as the sky turned from gold to deep purple. The palace lights began to glow in the windows. Outside, people were laughing, working, living. And somewhere in those ancient halls, a new kind of leadership was taking root. One, built not on tradition alone, but on courage, integrity, and the belief that the right thing is always worth fighting for. Thomas thought about the young woman who had refused to back down, who had gambled her career on principle, who had been rewarded not because she was obedient, but because she was right. And he thought about the prince who had seen that courage and chosen to honor it, who had drawn a line and said, "This is who I am, this is what I stand for." The power shift was complete, not because of force, not because of politics, but because of a single moment of defiance, witnessed by a guard who would never forget it. And as Thomas returned to his post, he realized that sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest changes. Sometimes. All it takes is one person willing to say no and one leader brave enough to say yes.